Now moving on, Benjamin Bryant, our next guest, was on the Fort Hood task force. He's been a lead writer on the lessons learned that the military did after the Fort Hood shooting.
Local law officials, FBI, scenarios, lessons learned, best practices had been identified, and they hadn't been codified or brought in under the auspices of DOD's policy or guidance.
So give us the example of that active shooter situation. In this particular case, it might have seemed to those of us as outside observers, hey, it was a hodgepodge, they just ran a bunch of law enforcement there. But you're saying there was an actual plan here, active shooter plan.
Oh, absolutely. That was the result that came out of 4.3. The result was that the DOD recognized that, in fact, the services had done some leadership on this, but what they recognized in the wake-up call that was Fort Hood was that we had to have a plan. We had to be adopting, we had to be reaching out and getting this fantastic body of knowledge, which involved, for example, neutralizing. Before, the old plan, as we note in the report, was when there's an active shooter there, you sort of hold tight and you call in the people who know what to do. And in an active shooter situation, what we've learned over time is what you need to do is you need to quickly identify and you need to neutralize that shooter. And so one of the things the military has become very good at is running those scenarios and planning for those kind of occurrences.
Say identify and neutralize. What do you mean by neutralize?
Well, neutralize can mean any number of things. In this case, it primarily meant getting them away where they can't kill people anymore. There are a lot of things. There are a lot of scenarios that can happen from that point on. But what you want to do immediately is you want to stop the killing. Personally, I grew up in the military. I often joke the first 2 decades of my life, every single thing I had was bought by the military, was paid for by the military. That was what shaped me. And when I hear that there's someone running around, and I know parents feel like this when there's someone on a school campus, or if someone's running around in a highly populated area, you feel that threat very strongly.
Taking place at a military installation, the possibility of there being additional shooters as well. What comes to mind so quickly is this a terrorist attack?
Of course it does. But the key thing to remember here is we can't get caught up on that, is it a terrorist attack in those moments. In fact, you may remember, one of the things the co-chairs and the Fort Hood Task Force got knocked around a lot for was, how come this report isn't all about Islamic terrorism? How come this report isn't focusing on the terrorism? Well, I tell you what, we got a lot of good people working on terrorist issues. But what we knew was more likely to happen than to have a terrorist every few years pop up on a military base. More likely to happen were workplace violence issues, were domestic violence issues, were random acts that quickly escalate, people who are mentally ill. And so in addressing that, what we really looked at is how do we make sure that when situations go out of control, where security is breached, where someone is acting in a way that is unacceptable and dangerous, how do we neutralize that? And if we get caught up in focusing on, is this a terrorist? That brings a lot of emotions into it. If you see a situation escalating, if someone you love or if someone you work with, is demonstrating risky behaviors, read up on them and talk to the right people. Don't gossip about it, but talk to the right people and get involved.
Well, I have to ask you, weren't there more security alerts put in place after something like Fort Hood, where you knew that there was a potential for people, even people who work for the military, might have a situation where their concentration is snapped, where their behavior is snapped, where...
One thing that's very important to note here is that he was in the Ready Reserve. That's latest my understanding from Secretary Mabus. And the Ready Reserve is not the same thing as what we traditionally believe of as the reserves, where someone trains, 1 weekend a month, a few weeks a year. The Ready Reserve is when you get out, but you're still eligible to be called back. You're no longer in the system in that traditional way that we tend to think of, where you're being screened by the military, where you're being treated in the military, and where you're being observed by the military on a regular basis. So I think that's important to note. So in the sense that I think the military has done a tremendous job in being able to screen and, more importantly, teach peers to observe these behaviors and report them and feel comfortable reporting them. But at the same time, there's only so much you can control, and that's why it's so impressive what they did when the shooting actually began. They followed their protocols, saved lives.
Yes. Ben Bryant, thank you very much for coming in and talking with us, giving us a little insight. We'll continue with more of America Tonight special coverage after a break.